Test, test, test. Test, test, test. Can everyone hear? Are we loud? Okay. There's just one more table. Good evening, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Stephen Windmueller, this evening. And for those of you at home, we welcome you. Shabbat Shalom. For those of you here, we are so grateful to Dr. Windmueller for joining us on this Shabbat. And I could go on and list the many accomplishments of Dr. Stephen Windmueller, the academic distinctions, the articles, the blog, the website, the status at HUC, the long storied history and career, and his expertise on the sort of the Jewish political landscape. But I would actually share, I think I can encapsulate all of that in a brief story, which is, I don't know if you remember this. When my wife, Deborah, was a student at the Hebrew Union College, she had Dr. Windmueller as one of her instructors. And Dr. Windmueller was invited to spend time at some conference or another in Israel. There was only one problem. At the Windmueller home, it's in Culver City, right? Oh, you moved. Okay. So at the Windmueller home at that time in Culver City, there were a lot of plants. And Deborah was invited or tasked, maybe it was for the grade, I'm not sure, with taking care of the plants while Stephen was in Israel, and was kind of given this, this needs to get watered. Now, at the time, and I've now been married for 16 years, Deborah can't keep a cactus alive. So I don't know, you didn't know that. But anyway, we were still dating, and we were still dating at the time, and I remember one night that we wanted to go out for dinner, sort of, maybe even in the valley, and Deborah said, no, I wanted to go to some restaurant or something, and Deborah said, no, we have to go to Culver City. I've got to water my professor's plants. And I'm thinking, we got to go to Culver City? And I said, can we, you'll get them tomorrow. Don't worry about it. Let's go out for dinner, have a nice night. Don't worry about the plants. And she goes, no, I can't do that. he's a really special professor, and that was Dr. Stephen Windmueller. I want to just highlight and underscore how true that is, because when my wife received my wife was offered the job to be the head of school at the Harold Schulweis Day School at VBS. One of the first emails that she received, one of the first phone calls that she received actually, was from Dr. Windmueller, wishing her well and trying to make sure that she would be settled in this new chapter in her life. And similarly, when I was named the senior rabbi here at Adat.REL, one of the first people to be in touch with me was Dr. Windmueller, wishing me well and asking if there was anything that he could do to make my experience more special and to make my to check in about me. I so appreciate that. I think that that really illuminates the type of person who is our guest speaker this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Windmueller.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that really warm and really meaningful introduction. Okay, we will try to work on this because this is a new challenge for the Windmueller.
It's already up. Here. Like every synagogue, everyone's, everyone's got an opinion on the sound.
So how does this sound? All right, thank you. This is an extraordinary Shabbat in that we still recall with great love and special meaning B. Reynolds. B, who was a part of my family as well as, of course, your community, holds a very special place in this house, as she does in so many places. B and her family left Germany just before Kristallnacht, as mine did. And this evening, as we both recall that moment 83 years ago, the 9th of November, 1938, and as we speak about contemporary anti-Semitism, we find ourselves joined by history, challenged by its realities, as well as its mysteries. This evening we will want to explore a number of questions. Why now do we face this increasing level of anti-Semitism? What is different about it than what we have seen before? What do we know about the past that can inform and shape how we will respond? And what do we need to do in terms of being responsive to our children and to ourselves in managing this moment? Let us be clear. This is not 1938 or 1933. This is not state-sponsored, government-based anti-Semitism. This is framed from 5 key factors. The pandemic itself, with all of its disruptiveness, represents one of those core elements. What we also have come to understand is that in this economic climate, conspiracy and the devices associated with misrepresentation of reality have stepped in. Social media is a phenomenon that 3.5 billion people around the world today receive their news, define their identity, and shape their opinions. That is a phenomenon unto itself that has captured and altered the current framework. We also understand at this moment that our society, our politics are deeply divided. The sense of civility and community have all but been lost. And finally, we understand that the level of trust that Americans have in the institutions that they once loved and respected has declined. The Congress, the presidency, the courts, religion in America, even the institutions of business and culture. From 1970, moving forward to 2020, we have observed this trust agenda decline. It has fundamentally reshaped how people view themselves and view this society. So these are the forces at work at this hour. What we also have come to understand is that what is also particularly different in this moment is the reality that as Americans and as citizens of the world, we realize that there are these unique and complex issues that remain unresolved. And people are used to solutions, to immediacy of outcomes, but that is not on our stage. And what we see in its place is a kind of paralysis and difficulty in dealing with climate change, or managing immigration, or understanding a host of other social and political issues. With all of that comes a new agenda of folks who seek to fill the vacuum where others have left it untendered. And in that process, what we are seeing and living with is an extraordinary upsurge in the politics of hate. And this is not only against Jewish Americans, it is against Muslims and African Americans and Latinos and Asians. It is against homosexuals. It is against all that are perceived to be the other or different. This is also a challenge on whiteness. America is, in a sense, a culture where white supremacy, white identity was a dominant historic notion. And now, suddenly, in the 21st century, that will no longer be the story. By the year 2050, this nation will cease to be a majority white democracy. What we will begin to see is this multiplicity of faiths and races and traditions that will reshape the American story. And this is very scary to many people. So whiteness then becomes a kind of tool, a kind of energy that drives much of this. And Jews are caught in the middle of all of this. Because on the one hand, the alt-right charges that the Jewish community and the Jewish citizens of this nation are seeking to replace them. You heard that in Charlottesville. Jews will not replace us. And what we hear on the far left is the notion that Jews have lost the privilege of being part of the victimhood status that they once could have claimed, that they are no longer a people of a minority or defaulting in terms of their political power and capacity. So whiteness then is the test. On the one hand, Jews are perceived as seeking to become white, and on the other, by the left, are seen as having claimed whiteness as a power grab. So we are caught up in an extraordinary period in our history, which is why so many books in the last 5 years have been specifically dedicated to the question of why here, why now. You have probably read many of them. They are designed to help understand this historic projection of anti-Semitism, as well as to understand the immediacy of what is happening and why it is happening. In this context, we also come to grips with the reality that what we are experiencing is actually being tested at this very moment in Charlottesville. Many of you know that those who were the leaders of the events in August of 3 years ago were folks who are now on trial in Charlottesville. And that will be an interesting test for all of us, because it will bring to light the mechanisms, the strategies, the tools, and the techniques of those who really seek to do ill in this society. And American Jews are certainly not immune to any of this. The data is very clear. The Anti-Defamation League reminds us in the year 2020 of the significant rise in harassment, vandalism, and other forms of hate crimes against our people. Those numbers were extremely alarming and challenging. What we have noticed in these 5 years, according to the Pew report of 2013 and now in 2021, is this extraordinary reality that American Jews in 2013 said to Pew that there was a sense of security in America. But in 2021, in the latest Pew study, those numbers are extraordinarily high. 75% of us reported that we feel an increase in anti-Semitism, we feel less safe, and we are deeply concerned about the status of minorities in this society. The American Jewish Committee report of just 2 weeks ago confirms that 17% of American Jews today will not go to a public setting where Jews come together out of fear that there will be violence in that setting. 25% of American Jews in that study said they will not wear a mezuzot or any other symbol on their body or on their heads as a statement of their fear and concern. And clearly, well over 80% of those in the AJC study reflected on this increased level of concern for their children and grandchildren about the character and content of hate in America. In so many ways, the question is, so what do we do about all of this? And how should we respond? First of all, we need to understand that most of the events we have experienced, whether in Pittsburgh or Poway, in Jersey City, or elsewhere, were events conducted by individuals, not by an organization. So what we need to remind ourselves, this is not the Klan, and this is not the neo-Nazis in some kind of banding together to create mass hysteria. These are one-offs. These are individuals who are simply reading, measuring, and acting upon what the Facebook messages they receive from these various core ideologies suggest. What we have come to understand as well, that in these one-offs, we see an extraordinary amount of challenge in terms of how we secure our institutions, our people, our community. The test here is increasingly a relationship that the Jewish community has formed in the past few years with the governments of the United States, our local state and city officials, our police departments, and the FBI. And this is a natural outcome of what is essential, because in a democracy, the first core question is the security and welfare of citizens, be they Jewish or of any other background. So the essential first agenda is self-protection. The second core issue is how we manage what we are feeling and seeing before us. The first challenge is to realize that much of the social media agenda needs to be held accountable, that those who create and operate platforms of this sort need to understand that hate messaging has no place in our society. This has been the task of the ADL and others to work on this, and they continue through their Silicon Valley operations to try and make that case day in and day out with these key institutional players. The second piece is the legislation essential on hate crimes. And indeed, to the credit of Hadassah, in January of 2020, Hadassah took the lead in creating a new piece of legislation which did succeed in the Congress in terms of Holocaust education, which is a piece of this larger story. Ultimately, by the year 2025, under this particular legislative initiative, it will be mandatory for school districts across the country to include the teaching of and engagement with the questions around the Shoah. And in order to do that, to the credit again of those who supported this legislation. It is funded with the efforts to make sure that those funds are transmitted to local and state bureaus of education and school districts. But that is only a piece of a larger story, because we are living with a generation that is fully removed from what occurred 1933 to 1945. The education of our young people about the questions associated with that moment in time, but also with the much larger issues in dealing with questions around genocide and racism and attacks on individuals because of their sexuality or their cultural attributes. All of that becomes the task of our schools, of our parents, of our institutions to reassert the kind of multicultural knowledge and engagement that will be essential. The United States has adopted the Holocaust Alliance definition on anti-Semitism. It is controversial to some, but it is now accepted among 30 of the nations of the globe, and it is a clear statement of what constitutes the act or crime of committing anti-Semitism. It lays out in all of its various definitions and statements the components dealing with the State of Israel, dealing with Jews as a people, dealing with individual Jews and their habits and practices, and understanding that as a community, we cannot and will not tolerate actions that in any way minimize our community, the State of Israel, or Judaism as a culture and religious tradition. The actions here are important because we now know that the United States has established an ambassadorship designed to deal with the issue of anti-Semitism. And as you may all know, Deborah Lipstadt has been nominated by this administration to serve in that position. Her nomination is in trouble. As of today, it remains unresolved in terms of whether it will be moving forward. There are those in the Republican Senate who object to this nominee on the basis that she did endorse and take action in the 2020 and 2016 elections, where she identified with the Democratic candidates. As a result, the chairman of the the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the Republican side, that is the minority chair, has indicated that his party will not at this time move that nomination forward. So we see in our politics, even in this moment where we have an extraordinary source of leadership and of particular expertise, being denied the right to assume her chair in that setting. We are also living with the reality that the events in May of this year involving the Gaza war generated in that 2-week period the highest levels of attacks on Israel, on Israelis, and on global Jewry in direct connection with the events surrounding the Gaza conflict. And there again, the task before us is a deep and abiding responsibility to educate that Zionism is not racism, and that to be critical of Israel is one thing, but to eliminate or seek to eliminate the existence of the Jewish state is clearly beyond the boundaries of acceptance. What we are witnessing then, both on the international front and even within our own country, is that anti-Semitism itself has become a kind of warfare, where folks have been given the kind of permission to, in fact, embrace and adopt views that at one time would have never been seen as acceptable. And this requires another response, and that is not from the Jewish community. It is from elites. It is from the president, from members of the Congress. It is from educators and civic leaders, basically suggesting and demanding that actions and statements critical of the Jewish people, the state of Israel, and our community are simply out of bounds, and they are not part of the American culture or the American tradition of civil discourse. So the tasks here are not just on the Jewish community to help frame a response through education, coalition building, legislation, and other steps, but it will require others to act with us and for us. It is also important that we note at this particular moment that what we are experiencing is something that has, in many ways, been particularly unique in the context of our nation's history. We have always understood that we could have disagreements with the left or with the right, but this is the first moment in American political history where Jews are engaged with both challenges on the left and on the right, which creates a very difficult step for navigating ourselves forward. So these then are part of the incredible pieces of this saga that we are now experiencing. Today at ASU University, Arizona State University, this weekend is Parents' Weekend and Homecoming Weekend, only to be marred by the fact, as Hillel reported to us earlier today, of a huge amount of anti-Semitic literature appearing across campuses. But that is true across many of our colleges and campuses over the past semester, over the past year and a half. We have seen an effort to really bring this issue on the ground to our kids across the country. The intention here on the part of those in the alt-right in particular is that they believe that this is a war to be won by engaging students and faculty on the ground in a way to change the American mindset about who are the Jews and how do they fit into the American story. Their argument is they have time on their side and they have generations to win. Our task will be, for sure, to push back wherever they appear and for whatever messages that they seek to deliver. So the construct here for us is very much that this is not what we experienced in the past. This is a different modality of hate. Indeed, in the 1920s and 30s, the ADL treatment of anti-Semitism was as if it was a pandemic. And their model was fascinating at the time and worked because it was designed to isolate the neo-Nazis, the Klan, or the organized groupings that occurred in that frame. The interesting commentary about the 1920s and 30s in fighting anti-Semitism was that at that moment in time, part of the burden was on the Jewish community. Jews should behave better, was what the message delivered by some. And the other part was that we needed to sometimes play low, disappear, not be so public, not be so present. The reality of that moment is so radically different from our place, our time. The reality is that we are amongst the most high-profile community in America today. Just let me cite a few examples to sort of bring that point home. American Jews sit on every major board, governing body, and institution of justice in this society. Members of the Supreme Court, significant numbers of members of the House and Senate, members of the cabinet, as we well know. But it is in the cultural and in the entertainment industries, and it is in all of the other core fabric and fiber of the nation's development that we find the American Jewish expression, as we should be, because that is the part of the American contract that we have had. And the essential issue here for us is that in this different role that we now play is very high profile, very much assimilated into the mainstream of this society. We are seen, therefore, as core actors. And how we treat and manage that question will be essential for all of us. I am of the mind that not all of the politics in this country will be easily resolved, precisely because we have a two-party system, and in a two-party system, it is impossible to meet the needs, the expectations, the dreams, and the goals of a society as large and as complex as this democracy. So the challenge here is as much about the American story as it is our own, in the sense that the American Jewish community sees itself, in a sense, caught in this web of the inability of politics to resolve and move issues forward. And that is something well beyond our own story. In the course of where we go from here, we take some lessons from what we can gather from the 1930s and elsewhere. First, that we are resilient. Our grandparents and great-grandparents understood that their lives, the lives of their families, were precious, holy, and essential, and moved to do whatever it was to preserve and protect themselves. The second was the fact that they understood that Judaism was something that was essential to who they were, and often celebrated that rather than opting to flee from it. They were also a generation that understood that it was essential to engage with political partners and coalitions. They understood the value that politics is something that one can build upon and create with others. They also understood the essential question that to preserve life and to extend the possibilities of Judaism to thrive in this world, it would be essential to also memorialize events that have taken place before them. The irony of Kristallnacht and Yom HaShoah is that it was very late in the American Jewish story that we would come to actually begin to talk about these days and to hear those stories and to understand the messaging of what happened in that period. Most of the energy placed in the American response to the Shoah comes in the late 1960s, not before. Only in Indianapolis, Indiana, and Richmond, Virginia, did two communities create memorials already as early as 1955 to begin the process of memorializing as a community those stories and those dates. But it is essential that now that we have them, now that we are without, however, the speakers, the voices of that moment, we at least have their lives, their stories, their memories, and these memorials. Kristallnacht is a very special day, as it ought to be in the Jewish calendar. On the night of Kristallnacht, German Jews were traumatized and isolated and fearful. Amongst them was one family who began to tear down the signs that the Nazis were putting up on the storefronts and on the homes of Jewish households. The price that that individual would pay would be his life, but it would be a reminder to his family and to all other families that resistance and responsible initiatives to ensure the future would be the hallmark of the family's memory and story. My grandfather died on Kristallnacht. He died in a small German town because he was not prepared to continue to allow the Nazis to act without a response. So it is a very powerful moment for me personally. But it is a powerful moment for all of us as we recall the memories and the stories of that particular hour. It is a call to us to continue the work that we must do in building the issues that will change what has created this kind of ugly nationalism and efforts to sort of equate behaviors and events as if they are all the same. This is our moment. For our children, we owe it to them. For our grandchildren, it is the responsibility of our legacy. So may it be. So shall we take questions? And should we bring the mic to the questioner?
Unfortunately, from what I garnered from what you said, our response has to be measured and intellectual, smart. The recipient of that kind of message, however, has to be persuadable. Unfortunately, from what I see and fear so much, you have cut to the chase and mentioned we're a divided country. We are worse than divided. We are a splintered country. And unfortunately, with that splintering, an intellectual approach that you've outlined for the Jewish community, because we are such a small community, appears to me to be impossible. But I don't know what action we can really take other than perhaps fleeing this country. Because what we stand for is the opposite of what apparently more than the majority do object to, in fact. So can you comment? How can you appreciate or accept or honor an intellectual approach?
Thank you for your comments and the question. I would argue that no religion in America is as appreciated and as welcomed as American Judaism. Every study points to the fact that Americans overall regard Jews and Judaism, the contributions we have made to this society, with a great deal of awe, respect, and high regard. So the first principle here is that the majority do deeply care about the status and well-being of American Jews. The American Jewish Committee study of last week did a corollary study with non-Jews, and it was extraordinary in the outcomes, because non-Jews see this, even if not as visually and emotionally, they understand this is an issue that deserves their attention and ours collectively. So the first premise is that we haven't lost the country. We have simply lost individuals who have been allowed, in a sense, to craft their message and move with it. The part here is very much the question of the good people being silent or being marginal. And what we need is certainly the loudness of the church and of civic society and of educational institutions and other bodies of law to reflect this thematic idea of the value added of the Jewish experience to this society. We were here from the beginning. We are amongst the oldest cultures of the American story, 1654. And we fought in every war in this nation, and we have given of our blood and tears for its welfare and development. I think this is not the question of leaving or losing this country, but certainly of working with others to change the character and the quality of what is happening in the country. It's a much more complex and difficult task. It's a hands-on task. And it's not one that suggests we give up and we walk away. I think that would be a terrible message to those of us who believe in democracy, and would hope that this would be a beacon to all of humanity, that when these kinds of conflicts and crises occur, that we are there to carry, along with others, the burden of rebuilding the ship and managing the future. At least that's my initial response.
How about one of the two of you? You guys you'll fight it out. I'll put the microphone in the middle.
Okay. My daughter came home from college with the idea of Israel being an apartheid is very hard. How do we separate Jews and Judaism from politics in terms of Israel as a country that is not our country, so we don't necessarily agree with it, but everybody sees, oh, you're Jewish, or
I think we have a job to do first with our own young people, because they often are amongst the leaders of the criticizers of the state of Israel, and certainly have the right to criticize, but also must start from the premise of what are the facts, the historical groundings, the cultural pieces that build and have built this complex story. So the first task is really the focus on our own young American Jews in terms of what they understand about this story, experiencing it firsthand, but also understanding the evolution of its history and its politics. The second piece is that in the 1990s, I think the American Jewish community made a serious error. We downsized a lot of the work we were doing around intergroup relations, both with regard to the Israel agenda, but also with regard to community-based issues. We did that because in 1995, we all began to believe that peace was at hand between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that we saw Oslo and the follow-ups as a kind of premise of what was about to happen. Of course, none of that did happen. But in downsizing a lot of the work of the national agencies and our local JCRCs and other institutions, we have left the field. And we are paying a price for having left the community in that regard. We saw it in California just this year with the issues around the school curriculum, ethnic studies. We were not at the table. The exception was the San Francisco JCRC was the only one at the table. No one from the agencies in Los Angeles or in Sacramento were really following the story. So we come late to the story and start complaining about ethnic studies and its anti-Jewish or potentially anti-Israel messaging. But we weren't there at the beginning, which was something we were prior to the mid-90s. We have no ongoing, sustained relationships with the kind of communities we worked with in the 1970s and 80s with African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans. So we've ceded the city to others in terms of the organized Jewish community's presence at the table, doing the hard work of dealing with elites from those communities. We're not going to reach a lot of the kids and a lot of the parish members and church participants, but we will be able to reach clergy, and we will be able to reach the CEOs of the major nonprofits. That is a real tragedy that we now have to immediately move to rebuild.
If I could just tack on to that, if you don't mind, I think we also made a mistake in the organized Jewish world, the way we taught Israel. And I have this conversation with a lot of my rabbinic colleagues who are my senior. We made a mistake in that I was reared on the narrative that that Israel was essentially Disneyland with falafel, right? Like the happiest place on earth where nothing could go wrong. And that, of course, is a standard which is unachievable by any society, right? So instead, the narrative that I teach our teenagers is a more nuanced one, right? That, of course, doesn't diminish my love for Israel, my attachment to Israel. I'm a proud Zionist. But Israel, like every other country, has its imperfections and it has its struggles. And so if from the outset you acknowledge that, it changes the dimension of the conversation. Instead of when the college students are brought up on a fantasy, and then that comes crashing down when they go to college, it changes really the whole dynamics of the relationship. So just a thought. One, two, then Gary, and then John.
Thank you. You talk about the threat coming from both the left and the right. I think you have to also consider that it's coming from the middle, and by that I mean the media. Just last week, there was a long travelogue type piece in the New York Times. The reporter went from northern Israel all the way to the south. I think he spent 2 months. There isn't a good word about the country in the whole article. Just today, there's a long piece in the New York Times about the the weakening of Zionism and the conflict between the reform and the conservative. And the whole purpose of the article, I don't think, is to teach you anything about Zionism, but to weaken Zionism. And so it's coming from the middle. It's not just the New York Times, it's elsewhere, but that's the biggest paper in the country. So I think it's not just the left and the right, bigger than that.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. In the 1980s, we used to work with the Los Angeles Times, by way of background, from 1985 to 1995, and Rabbi Rothblum was one of my partners at that time. The Jewish Community Relations Committee here in Los Angeles was regularly working with the LA Times over these challenging issues, the cartoons and what they portrayed, the opinion pieces, the news stories, the coverage and the quality of coverage. So this is an ongoing job of day in and day out labor of working with media about stories, because the folks who cover much of this are not really trained in the nuance and the complexities of these environments in which they are finding themselves. So your point is well taken, and it does require a consistent and ongoing effort to monitor and also to help educate and inform those who put out these kinds of news stories. Yeah.
You mentioned the alt-right and the extreme leftists and the people who are passing out the anti-Semitic literature on campus. But aren't all those people a really tiny minority?
Yes, that's a really interesting point. Their numbers are particularly small, but the power of social media gives them an extraordinary voice. And who is to constitute the truth associated with their statements? Because the power of the word is no longer sort of modulated by some measure of control. This is my telling you that this is the truth, and you're responding either to accept it or reject it or act upon it. And acting upon it is what really scares us. We believe that roughly 11 to 14% of Americans hold anti-Semitic views. This is based on the ADL measures that they use, which we won't deal with tonight in terms of whether that's a good quality of measure or not, but let's leave it at that. So what does that mean? That means 35 million Americans of some sort or another have particular views about Jews that are hostile, critical, or unfriendly. We believe that maybe 2% of that number will act on those views. Now, someone would say, well, what does it mean to act? It may mean writing a social media piece. It may mean joining the alt-right. It may mean marching in Charlottesville. It can also mean what happened in Pittsburgh, where a kind of solo voice acting on what he believed was that the Jews were bringing immigrants to this country that were undesirable, and that Hias was the problem, and that he was going to act on the tree of life as somehow an expression of his frustration, anger at what Jews were doing to America. But so we see that you can have 1%, but that 1% can be totally destructive and can totally change the culture and the comfortability of audiences such as ours. When Jews fear walking into a synagogue or have difficulty wearing a particular religious garb, or unwilling to send their children to a Jewish school out of fear for their safety.
I don't mean a position. Rest.
I didn't hear all of the question, but I believe it was about the left.
The left and specifically the
Okay,
Progressive
so
Coalition.
Rabbi, this is now a plug for the next presentation. My book on Donald Trump comes out in December. It's being published by USC, and it's an anthology that I've brought together 10 of my closest Republican and Democratic Jewish friends in a conversation on the impact of Donald Trump's presidency on American Jews in Israel. And there, of course, we look at these kinds of questions, but the question deserves a response. And from my particular perspective, I am deeply concerned that the Democratic Party is losing a piece of its voice and its pro-Israel agenda. Now, this is a very minority piece of that party, but it is a loud and very effective piece in the party. Their numbers are relatively small, but their power is significant because they have galvanized a particular set of constituencies behind them. And that is why it becomes challenging. You are probably aware, as a case in point, of the Sunrise Movement. The Sunrise Movement is an environmental group. They have a chapter in Washington, D.C., and they refused, quote, to march with the Zionists on the issue of voting rights. Nothing to do with Israel and nothing to do with an issue on the environment. But they would not and will not be part of a demonstration because the National Council of Jewish Women, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, and the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center are simply viewed as part of the Zionist agenda. So when you begin to convert all of your beliefs into these coded and singular kind of messaging, then this is problematic. I wish that the House had moved to be much more assertive in condemning anti-Semitism on the part of its members, on the one hand, and to push back on conspiracy theory and practice on the other, with Marjorie Taylor Greene. So, I think we have room here on both sides for a more assertive leadership in the House to say that none of that belongs in the discourse of our United States Congress.
Oh, Okay, so, okay.
In this era of DEI, where diversity, inclusion, and equity are so prominent, and where once we were on the other side of the equation, we wanted to be included, we wanted equity, and now we are classified on the other side. What can we do to speak to this issue as Jews?
First of all, just to remind ourselves that our history, the Jewish community never endorsed quotas. It was opposed to the principle of quotas, which already drew us a line at the time with some who disagreed with us on that. I think that the Jewish community has always felt that access for people who have been denied access ought to be a continuous policy and practice that we would encourage legislation and institutions to abide by. The basic position that the Jewish community has had on most of these kinds of questions has really not changed. Indeed, we have been the beneficiaries of so much of what has transpired in terms of access. And at another point in time, we should deal with critical race theory because it's complex, it's very emotional, and we need to understand that for some, the notion that if you are white, whether you're Jewish, whether you're of any other background, that whiteness has certain exceptional and possible options that are not available to people of color. And that alone drives the issue that every one of us, according to some within this critical race family, would argue we need to understand our inherent racism and our inherent sense that we have been the beneficiaries of a kind of racist society. That's very hard to hear. It's even more difficult to always even understand or accept, but it is something that we need to have conversations about. And I think that is in part why some in the political world are using CRT as a way to sort of continue the divide and accelerate the tensions between groups. And here's where I think the Jewish community has to say we have to put a brake on that, because we need to dialogue around what really are the issues here. And simply to use slogans of defunding police and creating the notion that all whites are racist simply doesn't take us anywhere. But we can't run from those conversations, but we've got to have them.
We want to be respectful of Dr. Windmueller's time, and so maybe one more question.
That would be fine.
Okay, so let's see, two, you've been waiting for a while. So one, and is two okay?
Two is fine.
Okay, there we go.
So you started to answer this a little bit, but maybe more practically. So I'm a parent of two college students. One is at a very small liberal arts school in which the curriculum of kind of the global issue classes, which are required for all, include anti-Israel material, but nothing on the other side, as well as the speakers who come from the diversity office are also anti-Israel, and they don't have the other side. So I guess more practically, as a parent, how do we put ourselves on the table so that that doesn't happen? Because what's going to happen is 10 years from now, those students are not going to get any other perspective.
So you are a major consumer of this university, meaning you are most likely paying your kids' tuition. You have a voice. You have a voice not to embarrass or in any way hurt your child's educational journey, but to share with the university your concerns about intellectual discourse and the honesty of that discourse. And that in a liberal arts institution, the word liberal implies that there is a reflective character to the conversation. That certainly allows criticism of the state of Israel, but also one needs to hear the issues facing the state of Israel and its challenges. So I think it starts with the effect of the student, the parent, the alumni of those kinds of institutions to consistently remind the university administration, its board, and its faculty that there is some accountability here. Accountability in terms of the intellectual development of our kids that needs to reflect that kind of diverse quality of education.
This will be the last question.
Thank you for extending your time. I was going to ask, basically, what do you think is the effect of the increasing what we might call interbreeding of ethnic groups? I mean, we know what's happening in the Jewish community, the percentage of Jews who are marrying people who at least were not born Jewish. They may convert, they may not. And I think the same is true with Asian Americans. We have a great deal of ethnic mixing. Is that going to affect any of the problems that we now are seeing? Or maybe it'll go the wrong way, I don't know.
It's an interesting point. The Pew study suggests that we have about 8 to 9% of American Jews who are Jews of color. That number will radically increase because people under the age of 18 in that circle are at 15%, which really already begins to show you the diversity from the bottom up. And across the board, we are seeing a huge amount of cross-fertilization, cross-integration of groups and cultures. That's the natural sort of behaviors of an open society. The effect of that on the politics will be interesting because the folks sitting on the alt-right, just as one example, will say this is exactly the problem of losing the white Christian cultural image and frame of the American story. And they will see this as affirming their point of view of closing immigration and challenging Jews and others in terms of their liberalism and their multicultural perspectives. So that's certainly going to be seen for us on the right. On the left, the tragedy or challenge is that a lot of the folks who have moved into these sort of multi-ethnic households, do not show from all of the data, the large numbers of religious affiliation and connections that we have historically seen. We just remind ourselves in the 1980s, the intermarriage rate in the Jewish community was under 20%. The decade 2010 to 2020, it was 71%. And that's based on the Pew study of 2021. So it tells us of the rise of the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, folks who are declaring themselves as basically not part of the religious establishment, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Mormon, because as that evolves, there is a sort of weakening of the religious fibers of the American story. And that is challenging because religion is one of those forces that I think brings a sense of rootedness and cultural affinity to one's life, one's story. And absent that, people are not sort of linked. They're not joined by these common themes. Robert Putnam spent a good deal of time in the 1990s writing about bowling alone. And his research and others suggesting the individualization of the American story. People simply not joining and not connecting. Well, the pandemic has only accelerated pieces of that, as we know, tragically. But it reminds us, therefore, that we really are struggling with the question of building ways by which people can find, a sense of commonality, whether it's in our tradition or any other, but that is certainly a weakening that we certainly see in this nation that is problematic to the sort of fiber of our democracy, at least in my regard. Thank you all very much for your patience.
We want to thank Dr. Windmueller for being our guest this evening, and we want to, when the book comes, we should have you again. And maybe this time not on Shabbat so they can purchase copies. And we want to invite everybody to a dessert out in the hallway. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.